Everyone, so I thought I would make a video of my top 10 favorite books of 2015. So I'm not going to rank my books from 1 to 10 because I found that very hard to do. So instead I'm just going to talk about them in alphabetical order. So the first one I'm going to talk about, I don't have a physical copy of it, but it's called A House in the Sky by Amanda Linhout and Sarah Corbett. And A House in the Sky is actually a memoir. So if you know me very well, you'll know that I typically go to books that are, in the fantasy genre. So picking up a memoir is something that was new to me this year. So A House in the Sky is the story of Amanda, who ends up traveling the world and seeing lots of beautiful places. At one point she finds herself in Somalia, and on her 4th day there, she gets captured. So her memoir is her experience as a hostage. She was a hostage for 460 days. So her story is, what she goes through while she's held captive. There's a lot in this book that is not easy to read, just because it's so hard to realize that these things are happening. I mean, it's one thing to hear about them or a little bit about them on the news and then feel terrible and angered and sad, but then when you read somebody's experience of it as they go through, it increases the gravity of the situation to the reader, and really helps them to see things differently. So what I really appreciate about House in the Sky is Amanda's resilience. She remained hopeful and she focused on certain things that she could look back on. She was grateful for some things. Despite everything that she goes through, she remains gracious, and what a strong woman. I respect her so much, and I think this is a memoir that really just kind of encourages everybody to be resilient, compassionate, gracious, and I highly recommend it. So if you haven't read a memoir before and you want to try one, I recommend A House in the Sky. If you like reading memoirs and haven't read this one, I also recommend it. The next book is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, and this is an absolutely beautiful book. It's historical fiction. It's the story of Mary Lore, who is a blind 6-year-old living in Paris with her father, and another story is of Werner, who's a German orphan. So this is a story about these two children and their experiences when the Nazis were planning to invade Paris. So Mary Lore and her father end up seeking refuge with a family member that they have, and basically at some point these two children end up meeting each other, and it's just the way that it's written and the way that it plays out, I thought was very beautiful. I think that's the perfect word to describe this book, because that's what it is. In ways, this book is very poetic. I think when I was starting to read it, I was getting used to the language, and so that might happen for some people, but read through it. It's good. It's very heartfelt, and I highly recommend it. I'm kind of sad to say that I don't know how else to describe this book other than you should read it, because it's, again, a great work. The next book is called An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir, and this book is a YA fantasy novel, and I actually wasn't very sure that I wanted to read this book because it was so hyped up, and from my previous experiences with other YA books, it's either they're hyped up with good reason or they're overrated. So An Ember in the Ashes is a story of Laya, who is just your simple girl who tries to live a simple life with her family, but the setting of this world is one that's inspired, by Rome and the Empire, and basically anything you do that defies the Empire equals punishment, imprisonment, or death. So Laya tries to live her life to make sure that she doesn't attract attention of people from the Empire, and she succeeds. However, one day her brother Darren commits treason and he gets imprisoned. So Laya, who of course wants to save her brother, ends up asking help from the resistance, and they end up agreeing with her in exchange for a service. So basically they want her to spy on the commandant of the greatest military academy of the Empire. And then when she gets in and works for the commandant as a slave, she meets Elias, who is the finest soldier in that academy. However, what's different is that Elias hates the Empire. So despite being its finest soldier, top student, what have you, he hates the way things are run. He wants to get out, and he ends up actually working with Laya at some point. I love the fact that their stories are so different but they do have some similarities as well. So Laia and Elias, not only as characters who, you know, are driven in this plot, but they ask a lot of questions about loyalty, you know, trust, things like, you know, how many wrongs are you willing to overlook to save your own skin, or how much are you willing to risk to save a loved one, or things like how do you decide who to eliminate or, you know, keep alive if both options seem to be for the greater good. It's dark, it's not something that you would pick up if you want a light read or an easy read, but I highly recommend. The next book is The Art of Raising Indurain by Garth Stein, and I really love this book. I'm actually sad I didn't end up reviewing it because I think when I finished the book I was just so impressed and speechless that I didn't know how to write a review at that point. So I said that I would get back to it eventually, but it's been so long that I feel like I would have to reread it again to write a proper review. But this book is about Enzo. So Enzo is the dog in the picture, and he talks about life, he talks about race car driving because he's very interested in that, and he's almost, I guess, sort of like an expert because his owner Denny is a race car driver. And Enzo's just funny, he's witty, he's very philosophical. So, and sometimes that's kind of interesting to see because you have to remind yourself, oh, right, this is from the perspective of a dog. But he's very insightful in some ways, very funny, and adorable. So I highly recommend this book, especially if you love dogs, and I think you would find things in here that, you know, you wouldn't expect to like or you wouldn't expect to find, and that is what makes this book so special. So it's a touching book, it's great, and I don't read a lot of contemporary books, but I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite books of all time. So the next book on my list is The Humans by Matt Haig, and this is an alien invasion story. So our book starts off with Professor Andrew Morton as our protagonist, and he's actually dead before the book even starts. So what happens is an alien takes over his body and acts like Professor Morton. So none of his friends or his family knows that he's dead, but this alien is pretending to be him because he's there to destroy a significant finding that Professor Morton discovered. So it's interesting to see how this alien, I'll just call him Andrew, how Andrew sees humans from an alien perspective. So I thought that was creative. Not that I've never read a book like that before. So for example, The Host was kind of similar, but the way that Matt Haig wrote it was just funny and in some ways quirky, and in some ways you're like, oh, I never really thought about it that way, but then now that you mention it, like, I see where you're coming from. So I loved it for that. The language I thought was easy to read, it was quirky in some ways. So I highly recommend this book if you're looking for something different. So the next book I'm going to talk about is actually just not one book. So it's a trilogy, and it's by one of my favorite fantasy authors of all time. If you've never heard of Robin Hobb, I highly encourage you to look her up, read her books, because she's amazing. She writes so well, and I am just a big fan. So what I'm talking about is, if I can pick all this up, The Live Ship Traders trilogy by Robin Hobb. And this is a very interesting trilogy because it's unique. So what I mean by that is, if you love, you know, your dragons, if you love sea serpents, if you love pirates and sea adventures, you will like this book. But what makes it so different is that the massive ships that they have are capable of thought, feelings, and they're alive, if you will. So I thought that was really interesting, and I think that's partly one of the reasons that really made me curious to pick this up. The major reason was that it's by Robin Hobb, and I just want to read it because I've heard such good things about it. So this is by far my favorite trilogy to date. I think of all the trilogies I've ever read, this one is just so well done. It's cohesive. It doesn't suffer the second book syndrome that trilogies typically have. So for example, the first book is really amazing, second book, not so much, and then third book is just like, okay, that was good, but then in the end it was rushed and it could have been better. So don't experience that at all with this trilogy. Everything actually gets better from the first book, and I don't think that happens very often, or at least I haven't found many authors who accomplish that. So I highly recommend it if you love character development in books, if that's one thing that you look for, and I know that's one thing that I really value. You are going to appreciate this so much because Hobb is just a master with her characters. I don't know how she does it. She makes them so real to you. She makes them feel like you know these characters, like know them so well that, you know, they're your friend or your family, and you really care about these characters. You get involved in their stories. You get angry when something bad happens to them, or you get sad, and if they go through sufferings and things like that, you feel it, you know, you feel bad for them. Another thing that I love about this book is this book has a lot of strong women in it. Now, a lot of the times I find when you're reading books and you find a strong female character, it's either they're, you know, they're an assassin, or they're really good at fighting, or, you know, things like that. But this book shows you that, you know, a woman doesn't need to be all that in order to be strong. And I really love that about this book because she approaches it in a way that is different for everybody, but it works and it's great. So I can't recommend this series highly enough, but I really hope that, you know, my little spiel encouraged you to pick it up because it is honestly worth your time. Now, the next book on my list is Me Before You by Jojo Moyes, and this is, this was kind of like a spur of the moment, I'm gonna read that because I'm curious book, because when I first saw this book, you know, Me Before You, I was kind of hesitant. Now, I am a hopeless romantic, but I have a certain degree of hesitancy, I guess, when it comes to picking up romance books, because a lot of the time I find them really cheesy and just overdone and cliche, and it's like, why did I bother? I cringe while I read this. And it's very rare that I find romance books that don't do that, that actually make it seem like, oh, okay, this is pretty realistic, like, you know, I can see that you care for each other without the typical cliches that couples do. So I was very pleased to find that with Me Before You. And Me Before You, I would say, is actually not your typical romance book. I wouldn't even call it romance, but Me Before You is a story about Louisa, who's a very ordinary girl. She's been living in the same tiny village for all her life. She doesn't really like to do a lot of things. I mean, she has a steady boyfriend, she works, but at one point in the story she loses her job that she's had for, again, a number of years, and she needs to find another one to help provide for her family. She ends up taking a job for a rich family, so this is where we meet our other character, Will. So she ends up signing up to be a carer for Will because he has been wheelchair bound from an accident that he had a couple of years ago. So Lou and Will are very, very different from each other. If Lou is your, you know, kind of mundane character, Will has seen it all. He's visited lots of countries, he's done a lot of things, he's very adventurous, very cultured, and they couldn't be more different from each other. If you've ever heard of this book, you'll probably you've probably been told that you will cry, and yes, you will cry. So like I said previously, I normally don't cry easily for books, but this book made me cry, like ugly cry. I was sobbing. At one point I had to put it down because I was just crying and I just couldn't go on without taking a break. And a few days after I was still thinking about it and getting teary. So I think that's a testament to how much this book impacted me, and that's why it's on my list. So the next book on my list is again a trilogy, so it's 3 books really. But it's the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. If you've never read anything by Brandon Sanderson before, pick this trilogy up because I think it's a good introduction to his books and his works, and I think you would really like it. So the first book is called The Final Empire, and I was very much impressed by the whole thing. I really liked the magic system in this book because it made sense. So not a lot of magic systems in books always make sense, I feel like. I feel like in some ways some of them have loopholes, but this one I thought was very well done because you do have limitations. I also found it very, very good because I thought it was very cohesive. The characters were great. There were a lot of characters in the first book, well, in the whole trilogy, but sometimes what happens when you have a lot of characters is that at some point 1 or 2 or 3 of them end up sounding the same, but Brandon Sanderson manages to keep them all individual and really giving them their own voices, and I thought that was great. Another thing too is that I thought the plot was good. There were certain twists that happened that I didn't expect, and that's always fun. And I thought that the length of it, I thought it was just perfect. The next two books, again, are also very good. It's kind of like Robin Hobb earlier when I said that it doesn't suffer the second book syndrome, which again is not easy to find. So I loved it, and of course the third book as well. So I thought this trilogy was very nicely wrapped up, and that the ending was very satisfying. All loose ends were tied up, and that is a plus in my book, and I highly respect Sanderson for what he's able to do as a writer, and I'm looking forward to what else he has. The next book on my list is Uprooted by Naomi Novik, and this was an absolute treat because I don't find a lot of good standalone books in fantasy anymore. Uprooted is probably the best standalone fantasy book I've read in a very long time, and by that alone I highly recommend it. It's different in that it's let's see, it makes you think of a dark fairy tale. So it's set in like a village near the woods, but the woods again are very dark. It's kind of like a dark Howl's Moving Castle, but not really. It slightly reminded me of it, but again there was so much more to it. I thought that the woods and was very well done. Like the way she wrote it, it was dark, but then you were like, wow, this is creepy and like, whoa. Again, I don't read a lot of books like that because I don't think I can take it, but this one was very, very good. I stayed up and I woke up early to keep reading, so I think I finished the book in 2 days. If I could have stayed up, I think I would have. So I highly recommend it, give it 5 stars, and I really encourage everybody to pick it up. The next book, or the last book on my list, is Vicious by V.E. Schwab, and this was, again, a really great read for me. It's a standalone that I highly recommend as well because it's so hard to find good standalones these days. Vicious is the story of Victor and Eli. They're 2 brilliant college students who are very, very smart, but they are curious in terms of, how are superheroes made. So they kind of researched stories that you would hear of people having supernatural strength, for example, when their lives are in danger, etc. So they kind of recreate that, and they actually end up succeeding. But the story starts off, I think, 10 years later when Victor breaks out of prison and then he's out to hunt Eli. So it kind of makes you wonder, well, what happened exactly for him to hunt his ex-best friend? But Vicious, I thought, was a great book that explored, good and evil, and how a lot of the times there really isn't a defined line. So Victor and Eli, even though they're now on opposing sides, both believe that they're doing something good. So I thought that was really interesting how V.E. Schwab was able to write that. It made you think, and how she just made it work in her story. So really, really happy I picked up this book. I highly recommend it. It is one of my favorites of this year, and 5 stars. So there you have it. Those are my top 10 favorites of 2015. I really hope that you are encouraged to pick, 1 or 2 or all of them if you've never read them, or if you've read them and, you love them, or you didn't like them as much. Let me know. Let's talk about it, and even share what your top 10 favorites of 2015 were, and I'll check those out. So thank you so much for watching this. It's my very first book talk, so it's kind of awkward, I know, in some places, but if you watched all that, thank you, you're awesome, and hopefully I'll get better next time, if there's a next time. And yeah, happy reading. I wish you all a happy new year, and best of luck to your reading goals. Bye!